Hello, friends and neighbors. My name's Elizabeth Reedy, and I'm the director of John Graham Housing and Services. And this time of year, as the days are growing shorter and we've had our first snowfall, a lot of us are thinking about our neighbors that don't have homes and may not be as fortunate as us. So a big group of us will be sleeping out on December 3rd in the Marble Works, and we're going to be having a vigil and a sleep out. And we have with us today Peter Kellerman, who's Assistant Director at John Graham Housing and Services, and Abby Sessions, who's the chair of our board. And we're going to talk a little bit about homelessness and what we as a community can do to reach out to others. So Pete, I know that you've been doing some work on the statewide level and also a lot of work in our 5 buildings here in Addison County. Could you just give a little overview of what's going on, what some of the trends are, what kind of people we're seeing, how many people we're
Sure
seeing?
thing. The good news is that the point-in-time count, which is done annually, has shown that there's been a decrease in homelessness. And so I think that it's important to recognize that all the hard work that we're doing throughout the state to try and eradicate homelessness is working. We have a long way to go, and I think at this point in time, it's important to acknowledge that there's been strides, but that we are far from victory, so to speak. For instance, the shelter right now is housing 65 people with 11 families, and that's a fairly high number, and I think it's indicative that we have a lot of work to do, but we're hoping that we can continue this pace and that we can continue to address the needs of our homeless brothers and sisters. And
So basically, we saw the numbers climbing for the past 10 years, and then, and you're talking about the point-in-time count, which is a one-night count of everybody that's either outside in places that are not meant for human habitation, like barns or cars or trucks, or in shelters. And then last year, I think in Addison County, we saw 33% drop and roughly a 28% statewide. So that's some progress, I think.
It is progress, and credit needs to be given when it's due. It keeps us hopeful and keeps us inspired. So I think that part of that success speaks directly to some of the programs that we're utilizing, and I know that at the John Graham Shelter we utilize a 3-pronged program where we focus on housing, rental subsidies, and services, and we put a lot of work into assessing people's needs right off the bat, making sure that we are familiar with where they're most vulnerable and whatever benefits that they're lacking, and put a lot of effort into helping them access those benefits, and then move in a direction towards permanent housing, which is quite a challenge for most people, given the fact that housing costs are quite high, wages are low, and it's very difficult to manage those challenges when you're in crisis and have experienced the trauma of homelessness. But a great deal of our time goes into direct services, and that's really where we seem to be making the greatest strides insofar as satisfying those needs and getting people housed.
Abby, you've served on the board for a number of years. What drew you to this kind of work?
Well, I've served on the board for 5 years. I just think it's such a need, clearly, to provide housing. No one should be outside, sleeping outside, living outside. So I think we have the capacity to offer housing, provide housing for everyone, and John Graham Shelter was an organization that was doing it. So I was invited to join the board, and I was delighted to do so. Since I've been on the board, we've actually changed our name to John Graham Housing and Services because of the model that Pete was just talking about, where service is a big part of what our staff offers. It used to be a homeless shelter or an emergency shelter was a place you would go, spend the night, maybe get a meal, a shower, a place to get warm. Now our model is much enhanced in that people make a plan for becoming housed when they come into the shelter, and staff like Pete and other staff members and Elizabeth work with people to make a plan to become permanently housed. And I think that's it's been a real change in the model that's happened in the past some years.
Yeah, and since under your tenure, we've also added some buildings that
We've
I think have
added two buildings in the last 5 years. We had 3 buildings, and we have purchased 2 more. So we do have the capacity to house 65 people and families. And in some of those buildings are apartments, transitional. Elizabeth doesn't like it to call them transitional, but I forget
rapid
the real
rehousing.
word. Rapid rehousing.
That's the HUD word.
Rapid rehousing apartments
Right.
where people can stay for usually for a short term before they
they're
can
getting
make
their
that
voucher
jump
and,
into the
exactly.
open market for housing. So I absolutely love serving on this board because it feels like there is a big need that we are able to meet, and not only meet the current need, but expand our mission to even have greater capacity to meet that need. So I just find it very fulfilling.
Yeah, well, thank you for serving. So, Pete, you mentioned that many of the families are working. So they're working, but where are they working? Why can't it used to be that if you had, when I was growing up, my dad worked and my mom stayed home with the children, but nowadays sometimes you have 2 people in a household working, and yet they're staying with us. What's up with that?
Well, there's several factors, one of them being wages are fairly low.
Like what?
Well, in many cases, our folks are working, which is great, and they're doing their part, but they may
Where
be
are they
making they may be working at Shaw's or Hannaford's. They could be working at Subway or Kinney's, but some of them are also working at Porter Hospital and UTC and Virgins. And not everyone has a low wage, but a great many folks are relying on minimum wage to try and sustain themselves. And given the high cost of housing, those wages cannot sustain the shelter expense that's pretty typical in our area.
You mean the housing?
The housing,
yeah,
correct.
because of course they stay at the shelter for free.
They stay at the shelter for free, of course, and then we help them create an opportunity to move on. But without a rental subsidy, the majority of our folks would not be able to afford the high cost of rent that we're facing, throughout Vermont, let alone Addison County, plus a 1% vacancy.
Yeah, wow.
If you're making a low wage and there's a shortage of housing, the level of competition is going to squeeze you out of the picture,
Right.
and it just increases the need for our advocacy, to work with landlords to give folks a chance.
Yeah. So one of the things I know that you've worked a lot on, Pete, is once a family finds a home, we try to help them maybe with a down payment or a first month's rent. It could be a utility deposit. And so we're trying to come up with this Sleepout, which is taking place on December 3rd, where every nickel is going to go right to people's housing, not to the organization, not to pay for operations, but right to the individuals. So, Abby, do you want to let people know a little bit about why you're sleeping out? How many times have you slept out now?
Well, this is our 3rd sleep out, and I've slept out the 2 previous times. Last time with my husband and my grandson. And this time will be the 3rd time. And it's just, it's a great way, I think it's a great way to raise money. I think sleeping out is a relevant activity for the work that we do. And so far this year I have 38 people who have made a donation. I hope for maybe 50 by the time the event comes around. And you know, I've raised a total of $2,800 so far in commitments, and other board members have, you know, have raised their little individual pockets of money too. So it's just, it feels like a really sort of upbeat community building way to raise money for a great cause, to help people get permanent housing. There, you know, when you move into permanent housing, as most people who've rented an apartment know, there are a lot of barriers, a lot of hurdles to get over. Like, first, sometimes you have to pay first and last month's rent in addition to the, you know, the month that you're actually renting, and their utility deposits and telephone connection fees maybe, and there's just a lot of expenses to be met when you're making that transition into housing. So it's really, I just love it that we have this fund.
How was it
by the
sleeping?
Sleepout. It was, well, I can, one of my great strengths as personal strengths is that I can sleep anywhere under any conditions.
Yeah.
So some people talk about hearing the bells chime on the church every hour.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. I don't have that problem. I hear it maybe at 10 o'clock when I'm
Right.
crawling into my tent, and then I hear it again at 6 o'clock. So
Wow.
that's, I count myself lucky in that in that regard. And
How
I am a backpacker and a camper, so I do have you know, equipment.
And so, you know, it looks like we could have sometime where between 30 and 40 more people are welcome. Everyone's welcome. I can say that the first time I slept out, we sleep out at the Marble Works, and right there by the falls. And so you hear the falls all night. You hear the bells from the churches, St. Stephen's and Middlebury Congregational, all night.
Right.
And I found that sleeping out to be really disorienting. And I can remember getting up the next morning, and I was giving a student from Middlebury College a ride back up on the hill, a young student that had slept out with us. And I remember thinking, you know, I'm so disoriented. I wonder if I should be driving. You know, no, because, and I just think about people who are living outside.
But yeah, I have to say I do feel kind of useless the next day.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not one of those people who's laying awake all night.
Yeah.
I do feel like I don't want to make too many commitments for things I'm responsible for.
Yeah.
You know, the next day, and you just realize that there are people who live their lives that way, and then you expect them to get a job and take care of their medical and do all the ordinary things that all of us do when they're living in a way that one night kind of sends us into a tizzy the next day.
That's right.
Right. It's an interesting event, and I remember last year something that struck me is that during the day, before the sun went down, I went for a walk in the general area, and I followed a path by the falls that I had never gone through before. And just a short distance from where we were sleeping out, I found some mats and some evidence of people who actually do sleep outside there. Right. And it just struck me. It was right next door to where we are, and it was a very meager. And I thought, if anyone was actually sleeping out here the way I am tonight, they're in much worse shape than I am.
So close to the town.
So close to the
where
town.
Everyone's inside and it's warm, and it's really tough. Well, there was that individual, we were able to house a person that had been sleeping out for many years. And one of the things that I've really noticed, a lot of people come to us, they're sleeping in cars, they're sleeping in barns. We recently had a family that was sleeping in a storage unit with children going to school from a storage unit. You know, that's not okay. Mm-hmm. It's not okay in Vermont. It's not okay in this country. Mm. And You know, my mother's down here at the residence in Middlebury, and I was leaving there one morning, and I was walking on this little path, and this woman was coming toward me. It was pouring rain. She had a bright orange umbrella. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I knew the face, but I couldn't say who it was, you know. And she didn't recognize me out of context, and I said, "I'm Elizabeth." And she said, "Well, where do you work?" And I said, "I work at John Graham." And then she said, "Elizabeth, you know, it's Julie." And then it all came, you know, she looked like a totally different person and told me she was going to work, you know. She was going to work, and we were just two women both on our way to work. But I totally didn't recognize her. And she told me about how her son was doing and how he was, you know, playing basketball. And, you know, it's just like people's whole demeanor changes, and when they have a place to live and they have some confidence.
Indeed.
So it's a big deal, you know. So.
And one thing that I love about how things are at the John Graham shelter, the original shelter on Main Street in Virgins, where people first come in contact with the John Graham shelter, is that everyone is treated with such respect and dignity and compassion, and everyone is made to feel welcome and valued there. And I just love that about the way we do our work.
Well, we try to create a little culture of kindness, you know, in the building. But I guess, you know, I know Pete has spent a lot of time. You know, we are also helping people get jobs. Could you just talk just for a minute about what it's like for some of these families with children who are working full time, coming back to the shelter, and how we try to move them into their own unit?
One of the most important things that folks in crisis and who are suffering from trauma need is some stability and safety. And I think the shelter aims high in both of those areas and does a great job, and has for quite some time, long before I came there, and part of what drew me to the shelter as a working environment.
What about some of these single moms with the little ones?
That they have their hands full. A lot of folks don't realize how difficult it is to make simple, let alone good decisions when you're in crisis, how to think straight, and when you're trying to juggle taking care of a child, taking care of your basic needs, trying to find employment or maintain it, transportation issues for folks who don't have a car, having a job where that lines up with the bus schedule, just in order to maintain some very basic needs that are necessary in order to move forward. So we do our best to provide a comfortable and stable environment to reduce some of that stress, and at the same time push folks, not push folks, but coach them in the right direction to make the best decisions. A better word would be to empower them, not necessarily to do things for them, but with them, and problem solve, because folks are resilient, and we do our best to feed that resiliency with the services we provide.
I'm thinking about, we have one parent, she gets up about 5:30 every day and gets ready, always looks beautiful walking out the door to work, and a little daughter who looks always spotless, and takes the bus, it's still dark, drops the little one off at a daycare in South Burlington, gets back on, rides the rest of the way to Burlington, and then works until about 5:30, repeats it, comes back and arrives back home at the shelter around 6:30 or 7, and then gets dinner.
Yes.
And, you know, to me, that person is a hero, and really someone that I think for her and her child, I just think that someone willing to put that kind of effort out is just something that I really admire and want to support. So.
Indeed.
So in addition to sleeping out, we're going to have a vigil. Do you want to say something about that, Madam Chair?
Well, it's sort of makes your heart glow to have people from all over Middlebury, from social service agencies, kids from the college, high school kids, on the green holding signs saying no one left outside, or a home for everyone, or all the things that we believe. And there's just really good, builds energy and encouragement, I think, for people who need a home and for people who are working to make those homes available. And then there's a dinner, soup and bread and cheese, and basically a soup dinner.
Yeah.
Down in the basement of St. Stephen's Church, right next door and nearby, so people can gather and visit and get to know each other.
Yeah. But all the churches and all the student groups and youth groups are invited.
Yeah, everyone's invited.
Yeah. So we hope that people will come out, and it's not too late to sleep out. It's funny because always some people show up that I didn't know were going to sleep out. And they just come and they, bring their cardboard or their tent, and they get up next to the fire. So we'll be having a fire right following the dinner. Yeah. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, two things. One is that it makes a difference to me, having slept out, when somebody calls at the shelter and I'm the one to take the call. We try to show some kindness and some hope to everyone, but even when you're full and you hear that voice on the other end of the line, sometimes the person is crying, or they're about to run out of minutes, and it really, I'm maybe a little ashamed to say it really does change how I react to it. Mm-hmm. You know what they're facing in the night ahead, without a place to go, and so it becomes not when but how we can bring that family inside. And from the Sleepout, we will have a little more in way of resources to do that. And the second thing is, I think this year, as much as ever, maybe more than ever, is a time for people to come together and to be able to, extend their own warm heart to someone else. We've seen some things that we haven't seen before happening around in the country, where people are made to feel that they don't belong. And I think here what we're trying to say with this event and with this effort is, that we're going to walk beside you. Mm-hmm. And
you do belong.
You do belong.
You do matter.
You do. Mm-hmm. And that no one deserves to be outside. And I don't know, for me it's a matter of almost proclaiming some of our values, I'm pleased that we've been able to work with people from Africa and from Iran and from Syria. And, they're a small percentage, but that people do feel welcome here. And I know, Abby, you've felt that same way. That,
yeah. One thing that I loved, last year in particular at the vigil, we had some of our former residents come and just join the vigil. I mean, they've moved on. One came down from Burlington. Yeah. A couple came from Burlington.
I hope they will.
A family who had been with us, and just their lives were changed by what happened at the John Graham shelter, and they were there, and there's an ever-expanding community of people who have benefited from.
Right. I mean, we have all religions, all orientations, all races, and everyone's welcome. Pete, we'll give you the last word here.
I think that one of the great things about the vigil and the sleep out is that it gives the greater community a chance to come together and become a little bit more closer to some of the realities of the folks that we serve. Mm-hmm. And at a time where there's a lot of uncertainty, whether it's local or national, even globally, there's a certain level of fear that I think visits us all. and people start to think about themselves and some of their needs, and there's a bit of a competitive edge sometimes. But this is a great opportunity, I think, for folks to kind of combat the tendency to become indifferent when
Right,
people are
exactly.
faced with fear, and recognize that there's a lot more power in coming together in a kind and compassionate way.
That's right. So just to recap, John Graham Housing and Services will be holding our annual vigil and Sleepout on December 3rd. We'll kick it off with a candlelight vigil on the Middlebury Green. Everybody's invited. There'll be a soup and bread dinner to follow at St. Stephen's Church. After that, we're going to have a bonfire at the Marble Works, and everyone is invited to sleep out so that everybody else can sleep in. Thank you very much.